And I want to begin with thanking you for inviting me and allowing me to be here. It's always, I think, an honor to have people listen to what you think. And with that said, before I begin, let me thank the people in blue, United States Coast Guard and others that serve, provide public service. But having been in Alaska for 40 years and a Marine, I appreciate that when you serve, you are in every day available for harm's way. So thank you. I also want to begin by telling you a little bit about myself, not for egotistical reasons necessarily, but so that you'll understand my biases. Over the last 40 years, during that time, after I was out of the Marine Corps and finished raising cattle and being whatever I thought I was in Oregon, I went to Alaska about 40 years ago. And during that time, I did serve as the first executive director of the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council. I was appointed, it was a joint appointment under court order, not my appointment, but the way that it worked, that the administration of President Clinton and former Secretary of the Interior, Wally Hickel, who was then governor again of Alaska, had to agree on an appointment, and I'm sure I was neither of those persons' first choice, but ultimately was selected. So it's kind of I guess, a consolation prize. I also want to mention that before I was executive director, I ran the Alaska Marine Highway System, which is a group of ships that the state of Alaska owns in and out of Canada and around the state and in and out of Washington, the state of Washington as well. And after that service at the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council, I was the governor's chief of staff and worked with Fran Ulmer's lieutenant governor at that time. And after that, I did serve most recently as an advisor to the United States Coast Guard and a member of the Deepwater Horizon ISPR group. I put away my slides and my speech that I'd spent 2.5 weeks developing and decided that what I was going to do is take what was said here over these last 2 days and the conversations I've had and my 40 years of experience, and I've been on kind of a semi-sabbatical this last year, and I've been reading about accidents. There's nothing more difficult, emotional, environmentally for me than flying over Prince William Sound in 1989. And later, as I served as chief of staff and watched a variety of incidents and worked closely with the oil companies, God knows I spent my time in Texas with Lee Raymond from Exxon and others. God bless them for the lessons they taught me the hard way. I want to say that I think what we've learned is that oil and gas exploration, production, and transportation are complex, tightly coupled systems, and that like other major industrial projects, introduce dangerous, complex situations that have interactive complexity. Got that from Thad? And sometimes they collapse through interacting failures among the components in ways that the developers and government didn't prepare for or consider because they deemed them unlikely or unreasonable for consideration. I'll talk about this in a minute, but all as a result of risk repression. We don't want to think about the risk. And in my readings recently about why accidents happen, I learned about cognitive dissonance. And I'll just mention this briefly. We suffer that every day. When I'm having a beer and reaching in the back of the refrigerator for salsa and I don't want to move the milk or do something else with my beer, I hold the beer in my mouth and I gently move the milk aside and I drop the salsa. Because I'm having cognitive dissonance. I know I should take the time to put everything down, move the milk and get the salsa, but I don't do that. And now that we know under Citizens United that corporations are citizens of this United States, they have an obligation to think about what is happening and not avoid the cognitive dissonance that they feel when there is an unreasonable or unlikely situation of a blowout preventer failing. I want to walk through 5 points. First, catastrophic bad things happen. And when it's a mega industrial project, the catastrophic event is devastating. And there's commonalities to those failures. There's reasons they happen. We cause them, and it is a matter of policy and politics. It's a lack of prudence. I got that word from an article just written about Shell and their approach in the Arctic. Second, oil and gas exploration is a dangerous mega industrial project, and like those other projects, they can put serious toxins in our environment. We need to have a comprehensive scenario analysis. That's what we've been talking about. And we need to have a process that challenges those unlikely situations and analyze what we would do about them. Third, and I mean this respectively, I've known Sarah Palin for many years. I've worked with her. But just drill, baby, drill suggests ignorance is bliss, and we ought to proceed with that ignorance. But the real saying there, as you recall, is if ignorance is bliss, wisdom is folly. I would suggest that prudence is thinking with understanding about the nature of the thing or the environment you're in. We need an understanding of the ecosystem in which we are involving ourselves, in which we're proposing this major anthropogenic industrial project. And we need stricter standards that will protect that environment. Fourth, an unlikely event has unforeseen circumstances. And in many instances, it's because we lack information. And we ought to be proud of deferrals. We ought to be, as Americans and as citizens and corporations, proud that we're going to take the time to further understand the situation before we just drill, baby. Fifth, we need to look at where we're leaping. The National Contingency Act provides that we understand the ecosystem and that we identify important ecological areas, environmental sensitive areas, and that we identify them and protect them. We don't do that. The President and the Secretary have the authority to identify areas that ought to be protected and designate them and avoid them. And let me just say, I've spent 5 years reading about the Arctic and working with scientists, some 30 years talking with people who really know what they're talking about. You could do offshore drilling in Alaska, do some deferrals that would allow you to get the information, and designate important ecological areas like Hannah Shoal or the Bering Straits or Barrow Canyon or the coastal area, and not interrupt what is currently the leases or even where people are proposing to go. I've got to move along. Let me give you 3 examples quickly. And believe me, they're laying in front of us. All we have to do is look and you'll get the point. Back to the salsa. I don't know how to talk about Fukushima without tearing up because it affects all of us. And it's in the press today. They're about to take the lid off of Fukushima, off of reactor 1, to remove, 2 people have mentioned this already. They're going to take the fuel rods out. It's the most dangerous and the highest risk that they've had to deal with. And you know why they're dealing with it? Because TEPCO, the designer and operator, the corporation that had the contract, and the government couldn't deal with the cognitive dissonance of considering a 14-meter tsunami. It is that simple, although they would say it's that complex, because their goal was to have low-cost energy of nuclear power produced safely, and they had people tell them they could do it except for a few anomalies and considerations, like a 14-meter tsunami, which had happened several times. But because of that uncomfortable feeling, they want to keep the bottle in their mouth and move the milk and reach for the salsa, because they had a preferred outcome. They didn't want to deal with the deferral and the delay and the protection. They tore down the bluff to put in the plant next to the water because it was most convenient, not taking the time to hear from people that they needed to consider the risk to the water and the fisheries, the ocean coastal area, or the tsunami, or tearing out the bluff and what the consequence was going to be to the bluff. It was as simple as that. There were some things they could have done that wouldn't have put us all in this situation today. Daniel Farber at the University of Berkeley describes it this way. He describes risk repression. It's the failure or refusal to take seriously evidence that contradicts a preconception or our preferred outcome. We just don't want to do it. We could make bigger money. We got $6 billion invested already. My ass is on the line. I got to drill. I need to drill. Let me just mention also Nancy Levinson, who some of you know from MIT, who was tremendous to work with during the Deepwater Horizon. And while she was doing that, she talked about her system of safe engineering. She calls that a recipe. Admiral Allen talked about this, and this came up twice today. She talks about the first issue in her recipe of accidents, as I've been reading them, is flaws in the safety, culture, and policy. And she talks about organization and sometimes the whole industry, including government, wants to hear that it can be done, wants no delay. It's a matter of policy. So what does all this have to do with oil and gas? Just quickly, let's just look at what we've heard. In Exxon fought the state over double-hulled tankers because they didn't need them. They politically were able to move and ultimately legally force the issue that single-hulled tankers in the United States, and in particular in Prince William Sound, weren't necessary because they weren't going to hit anything. And if they did, those tankers would be fine. Let's look at that whole scenario of cognitive dissonance. It wasn't going to happen. As someone described, here's the Exxon Valdez. The Coast Guard's funding had been reduced, so the tracking facility radar wasn't functioning. The person on duty was the night guy, the night officer who was doing his job but didn't have the equipment. Captain Hazelwood, appropriately probably, took the tanker out of the traffic lane, exiting with a full laden ship, and took it away from the laden to avoid ice. He then went below to have a drink and told the third mate, Cousins, you take the bridge, I'll be back. Cousins proceeded to take it out, but didn't take it back into the lane because they hadn't discussed it, reportedly. Twice, a female crew person comes to the bridge and says, third mate Cousins, there's a red light buoy on the starboard. Impossible, he said, go below. She came back a second time and told him. And as many of you know, red light returning, and we didn't have a red light returning. We were going out. It should have been on the port side, not the starboard, as many of, if not all of you know. He didn't say that he recognized the situation till he literally saw the light on Bly Reef. Now, he wasn't going to hit it, if you go back and look at the record, because that reef had been on the charts since 1778 when Captain Cook put it on the charts. Nobody's going to hit that reef. We don't need double-hull tankers, let alone a pilot on the bridge. They ultimately complied with some of the restrictions because the state of Alaska insisted on certain standards. Let's just quickly run through the Deepwater Horizon, and I'll just say this. The Big Bop failed, and we didn't want to anticipate it. And I'll say this about the Arctic, and you'll know this about this conference. This conference, like every other conversation I've had about this since 1989, there's 5 things that we need to do. Number one, and this is all, I threw out my speech. This is all what's come out of this. Number one, it was just said twice here. We need a comprehensive ecosystem monitoring, observation, and research program of the ecosystem in which we're proposing an activity. We need to understand what's happening. We need a description which was said this morning, of the sensitivity of the various species and the local community's interaction, like subsistence. 2, we need a comprehensive scenario analysis, including the challenges of that analysis by a red team or a group of people. We have an ISPER group that's put together and recognized after an accident to look at where we prepared and how did we respond. But we don't do the same thing until we have the accident. I'll come back to that in just a second. 3rd, we need strict Arctic standards. We need those Arctic standards, and that includes a group of scientists, including local and traditional knowledge, in the case of the Arctic, people who live there. And we need to have those standards established and held to, not because it's more convenient to let them go because it's uncomfortable to think about what they cost. Those standards need to be in place before we drill. 4th, we need deferrals. If we need more time, we need to think about the long term. We need to defer some areas until we know more. And 5th, we must have a designation of important ecological areas. The President and the Secretary have the authority. It's a matter of policy that we avoid even the discussion. And again, you could do that without interfering with the existing leases in the North Slope. There are 3 things that have been brought up. One was funding. Let me tell you about funding, because it's all been mentioned. I'll stop. Funding. 1, I'll take the time you took from Maryland yesterday. So, number 1, fund comprehensive monitoring, observation, research with a penny a barrel, and some of the money just like they did in Louisiana. 2, establish a policy of standards, deferrals, and designations. And 3, appoint this group I just talked about with Thad Allen and Marilyn Hyman and a couple of members here, and Kate Moran and Marcia McNutt, Larry Dietrich, and have Fran Ulmer chair it, and take a look at what's happening in this area. Thanks very much, and thank you.
Thank you. Excellent, thank you. Great 5 points. I'm going to turn it over to someone who you all know, David Kennedy. Not only has he... sorry, Peter, just hold on.
I just got so fired up.
And many of you know David. He helped put this forum on, and now he is currently a special advisor to the NOAA administrator, Dr. Sullivan. So I'll turn it over to David.
So Nancy, I've got about 20 minutes of stuff here, and when Nancy and I were putting this session together, I said, you know, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that we get out in the session, and they have to do with the fact that there are some pretty good policies in place for oil spill response. There's a whole group of folks that are well versed in those policies and how to use them. And my experience over my long career in doing response is one of the things that probably gets in the way quickest and most in going out and getting that job done is politics. And so I said, I want to be sure and have somebody on this panel that will talk about that. Here I am. That isn't what I had in mind, but the good news is this. What I wanted to say has really already been said, Nancy, over the last couple of days, and I couldn't have a better spokesperson than Admiral Allen. He really has talked about most of what I would say. So the point I want to make is that politics really does interfere with an operation. I'm going to get to a quick end here to talk about, okay, what can we do about that? But we have example after example after example. I give 2 quick ones. One, Exxon Valdez. We got a beach out there that's been renamed Quail Beach. And I don't know, there may be a few of you in this room, a very few of you in this room that know about Quail Beach. I was flying every day out over the oiled areas, and you've seen some pictures about the incredibly severely oiled beaches. One day I'm flying out and I look down at a beach that routinely would have dozens of people cleaning, has nobody on it. Yet there seems to be a construction project going on. So when I landed, I said, what about X beach? There's really something strange going on. And I was told, well, all the cleanup workers have been pulled off because Vice President Quayle is going to come visit, and it's been determined that we don't want his feet to get oiled. And so we're building a platform for him to land in a helicopter and walk out onto that beach to observe the oil. Politics interfering maybe with operations. Deepwater Horizon, already been mentioned. We had Bobby Jindal's sand berms. You heard all of the discussion about, all the science said don't do that. What you may not have thought about is the incredible number of resources from all of the agencies, state and federal, and I'm talking all the federal agencies, that had to pull experts off of doing what they should have been doing, and that's kind of specifically looking at the issues surrounding the oil and where it was going and what it was affecting, to have huge debates and long, long discussions about why we were doing these berms and how you might be able to justify it. That didn't take a day, that didn't take 2 days, it took weeks away from what should have been more on the ground, attacking the oil spill to do that. Again, politics at play. So what do we do about that? And again, Admiral Allen has talked about this. I think, one, we need to have, and this was mentioned as well, we need to have a strong leader at the top of whatever the response organization is that has the ability and the credibility to draw lines in the sand occasionally and say, no, we can't do that. We can't play politics in this. There's too much at stake. We've got to move forward. I know some of that was done. You can't do it all. Two, I think we probably should be looking at really incorporating how do we play the political game better into some of our drills and spills and responses. I think that's something that we probably don't put into responses that I'm aware of. But the three is, and this too was mentioned, we have to deal with it. It's a reality. We all know that. So how do we deal with it? And there's already been several suggestions here today. Very early and often, we need to be educating both the local politicians and the national politicians. When we have an event, a huge event, we need to be reaching out to them. We need to get them on board. We need to let them know what's going on. We need to make sure that they're with us instead of having to second guess what it is we're doing. All those things would help. But ultimately, as I say, it's a reality. We have to deal with it, and we need to plan better to make sure that we accommodate that in our operations, along with limiting to the extent we can how much we have to dip in to playing that game. Thanks.